Hey guys. Okay, so I thought that to reinforce my learning and understanding of the pathophysiology of all this stuff, I wanted to kind of like teach it to myself. And then I thought, well, maybe there's going to be other classmates of mine that could find this beneficial. So here I am recording a video, doing my best to explain it. Again, I'm no expert on this. I'm also like learning as we go. But hopefully this kind of like cuts down on having to read the book. And yeah, most of us want to know the pathophysiology, but we don't really get that. So this is kind of what I'm trying to break down for myself, and if you wanted to watch and listen. Okay, so we're going to start with the chapter 53, which is drug therapy for seizure disorders and spasticity. I'm going off of the study guide, the PowerPoint, and the book. I'm trying to like kind of keep it condensed. Like I don't want to overstudy things, so that's why I'm referring to the study guide that she sent out. So yeah, let's start. I'm gonna try my best to like have you see what I wrote down. Some of it is small, so yeah. Okay, so seizures and epilepsy. Let's talk about that. Epilepsy and seizures are kind of used interchangeably, but the thing is they are different. So seizures occurs when many neurons in the brain are firing all at the same time, which leads to not only the brain being overwhelmed, but the body being overwhelmed, which makes sense because we know that when someone has a seizure, they're like doing like some crazy, they're either doing some crazy movements or there are other like seizures where it's like they're just staring off into space, like Ramiro was saying, right? So that's what a seizure is. It's when the brain is firing so many, the neurons are firing all at the same time, and it's just like overload. And so yeah, the brain and the body just get so overwhelmed. Specifically, a seizure is a one-time event, while epilepsy, there's a history of 2 or more seizures occurring. So that's abnormal. Before we talk about the abnormal, let's talk about the normal, okay? So in someone like myself, someone who's pretty healthy, the normal neural function is each neuron fires one at a time and as needed, okay? And the point of these neurons firing, this is how they communicate with one another. So these neurons communicate via what's called neurotransmitters. And if you can kind of recall back to first semester pharm and like however many years ago you did pathophysiology, really common neurotransmitters is acetylcholine. And then something really important for this chapter is the neurotransmitter, gamma aminobutyric acid, otherwise known as GABA. So these are the 2 super important neurotransmitters involved with this chapter, with seizures, GABA and acetylcholine, okay? So let's continue to break this down. We have 2 types of neurons. We have excitatory neurons and inhibitory neurons. And it's in the name, excitatory neurons. These keep the signal going. So this is one neuron to another neuron. These would be considered excitatory because this neuron's relaying it to this neuron, then relaying to this neuron. So it's just go, green light. And then we have the inhibitory neurons that basically are saying stop. It tells the signal to stop relaying those, stop sending out those neurotransmitters. So in normal function, there is a balance between excitatory neurons and inhibitory neurons. Good. In seizures, which is bad, something triggers the normal communication to break down. So 2 things can either happen. So I'm going to try to fix the camera angle so you can kind of see things better here. Okay, 2 things happen here. One, the excitatory neurons can become too active. They're overly active and they're shooting. Or the inhibitory neurons aren't active enough and they're not saying stop, which then results in the excitatory neurons taking over and they just keep on firing and they're just like, go, go, go. And that results in a seizure, everybody. But what triggers it? So that's what I'm going to talk about now. What triggers these seizures? And the scientific word for triggers would be etiology, which is on page 107. It's like kind of the first page. I'm going to try to break that down to you guys. What can cause these triggers are there's an increase in intracranial pressure. Mind you, seizures, the point of origin is the brain. Okay, so try to think about that. Like all of these triggers, most of the etiology stems from something abnormal or something really unique that's happening in the brain. Okay, so like I said, there's an increase in intracranial pressure. Perhaps there could have been head trauma, pre-eclampsia, and from my understanding, if I got that right, let's see. Eclampsia is when a pregnant woman gets a stroke. So etiology or trigger is a woman who is pre-eclamptic, if I'm correct. I think that's right. Anyways, moving on. Hypoglycemia, which makes sense. Our brain uses glucose to function, so if there's a lack of glucose, that can mess up with the neurons communicating. Fever, meningitis. This one's pretty important. A trigger is electrolyte imbalance, specifically sodium. And in our PowerPoint on slide 12, it talks about the actions of anticonvulsants. They work in 3 ways. One of them, which is phenytoin, otherwise known as Dilantin, the trade name. Phenytoin, which is a hydantoin. Okay, that's just a drug class. Nonetheless, the mechanism of action for Dilantin is it suppresses sodium influx through the drug binding to the sodium channel when it's inactivating, thus prolonging channel inactivation and preventing neural firing. That's what that says. And then what's another way to explain that? That's more digestible. The mechanism of action of Dilantin, according to the textbook, it's delays the influx of sodium ions into the neurons and preventing the excitability caused by excessive stimulation. So, fun fact, this is the oldest and most widely used AED, so anti-epileptic drug. It's the initial drug of choice in adults, and it's prescribed for seizure disorders and sometimes even cardiac dysrhythmias. Fun fact. Okay, and then also another trigger could be a tumor, like a brain tumor. We're almost done. I know it's kind of long, but something in the study guide that she wanted us to know are general versus partial seizures. So this is the last part I'm going to cover in this video. Hopefully in the next one I'm going to try to do my best and cover the drugs. Okay, so pathophysiology of seizures. We have partial seizures, general seizures, and then other seizures. So I'm going to just kind of skip by the other. And then we have a super important one. It has its own category, status epilepticus. So let's start with partial seizures. So partial seizures, this seizure, there's a specific part in the brain, therefore it's indicative of a local brain lesion. So there's a specific part in the brain, basically, that causes this. I'm really like, you get it. It's a specific part of the brain, okay? Examples of local brain lesions, it could be a birth injury, it could be trauma, it could be stroke. Like again, stroke, would affect one part of the brain. It doesn't, most of the time it affects one part of the brain, a specific part, as opposed to the whole brain, you know? Not the whole brain loses oxygen there, it's just that one part. So that's what I'm trying to stress right there. Or a tumor. Partial seizures get broken down to two other categories, which is simple partial seizures and complex partial seizures. I don't know if we really need to know that, but just so you know, in a simple partial seizure, the patient's consciousness is not impaired. And then in the complex partial seizures, the patient's level of consciousness is decreased, okay? And then we have general seizures. So according to the book, it's saying it's bilateral and symmetric. Don't really know what that means. And again, there's no discernible point of origin in the brain. It's general, okay? The most common type of general seizure is a tonic-clonic. And basically what, like, broken down tonic is stiffening and rigiding. What happens here too is like the patient would be crying or moaning. And then the clonic is rhythmic jerking and hyperventilation. So the most common is a tonic and clonic, so it's a combination of both. Let's see. So other seizures, we have the febrile seizure, which is seen in children, and then the absence seizure. That's what she was saying on the board. It's also called in the PowerPoints, it's also called a petit mal. It's a brief, sudden lapse of loss of consciousness. So it's abrupt alteration in loss of consciousness. And then lastly, we got the status epilepticus. So this is a medical emergency. This is life-threatening, which results in the patient showing they're hypotensive, they have hypoxia, cardiac dysrhythmia, and that makes sense. Again, let's try to this is the whole point of me talking about it. The cardiac dysrhythmias make sense because over here, the etiology, there's an electrolyte imbalance in the sodium channels, right? And those are common in the heart. So anyway, status epilepticus results in cardiac dysrhythmias, also permanent brain damage, and even death, unfortunately. So what is the most effective drug therapy for status epilepticus? In our book, it's the drugs that fall under the drug class benzodiazepines, which is diazepam and lorazepam, and I believe those are two drugs that she also wants us to know. Does it? Yeah, I think so. She wants us to know Dilantin. Okay, so yeah, for benzodiazepine, she wants us to know diazepam, lorazepam, and clonazepam. But yeah, just so you know, the most effective drug therapy for treating status epilepticus is benzodiazepines. Now I'm trying to see if there's anything else. Okay, so that's part one. This covered, hopefully, the pathophysiology, etiology, and yeah, cool. Let's try to break down the drugs now.